The sun lifts over ridges of grass and broken clay on the 25th of June, 1876, along the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory. Cottonwoods throw narrow shade at the bends. A large village stretches along the water circles of lodges belonging to Oglala Lakota, Hunkpapa Lakota, Miniconjou Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and a small Arapaho party. Across the high ground to the east, dust hangs where United States Cavalry has ridden through the night. The larger campaign frames this morning. All spring columns under Alfred Terry, John Gibbon, and George Crook have moved to compel non-agency bands to return to assigned posts after winter orders tied to Black Hills Gold. Crook has already fought at Rosebud and turned back. Terry now pushes a plan that depends on timing guesses and a river maze. Into this frame rides the 7th Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer. 12 companies, a pack trained scouts who read sign where others see only grass and stone. Ammunition and rations ride on mules that fix the regiment's speed. The distance between moving parts is a risk that grows with every mile. Down in the valley, the village follows summer logic. Families are near water, and grass pony herds graze and lookouts sweep the bluffs. The people here know the country by ridgeline and coulee, by where willow thickets break wind and where a rider can move unseen. When danger comes, war leaders call and men mount fast. The cavalry sees signs that swell from scattered tracks to a road of hooves. Scouts point ahead and urge caution. The village is large. The river bends hide its length from any one vantage on the bluffs. What looks achievable at distance may be impossible at contact. The stakes are more than a single fight. Policy set the collision when agency deadlines met gold pressure and a shrinking buffalo range. If the regiment can strike fast and hold, it may force a surrender on the river. If it cannot, the village may absorb the shock and answer with numbers. Our question is precise. Not how Custer died, not the final minutes fixed in legend, but when the battle turned against him. Which moment converted a bold plan into a failing one? What mixture of terrain, numbers, and timing decided the day? To answer, we will hold to time and place. We will follow orders carried by couriers, dust lines that mean movement, and the gaps between battalions as they widen or close. Names will appear where the record supports them, and silence will be noted where the archive is thin. On this ground, the turn is a measure of minutes. Winter orders in late 1875 set a line in time. All Lakota and Northern Cheyenne people outside agencies were told to report by the end of January 1876. The order followed the Black Hills Gold Rush that began after the 1874 expedition under George A. Custer. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 had promised the Black Hills to the Lakota. The discovery of gold and the rush that followed bent the promise. Agency officials along the Missouri recorded missed deadlines as winter storms held camps far from issue points. Messengers went and came with mixed news. Some bands stayed out to hunt. Others moved in and then left again when rations were short or the rules pinched hard. The ground was wide and the weather cut travel. By spring 1876, the War Department set a 3-column plan. George Crook moved from the south from the Platte and Powder Country. John Gibbon moved from the west up the Yellowstone. Alfred Terry with the 7th Cavalry moved from the east, from Fort Abraham Lincoln toward the Tongue and the Rosebud. The plan depended on finding a large village and closing on it from several sides. The United States' aim was to compel return to agencies and secure the Black Hills for miners and settlers. Constraints were long distances between columns and thin lines of supply. Telegraphs reached posts, but not the valleys. Scouts were few, and the country was a maze of breaks and coulees. Pack mules fixed the pace of every march. For Oglala Lakota, Hunkpapa Lakota, Miniconjou Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and a small Arapaho party, the aim was to keep families safe and free while the grass was good. Constraints were the need to move with elders and children and to guard large pony herds. Advantages were deep knowledge of the country and fast gathering of fighters once danger was seen. In early June, Crook met strong resistance in the Rosebud country. On the 17th of June, fighters under leaders including Crazy Horse struck his column. After hours of heavy skirmishing, Crook pulled back toward Goose Creek to refit. The effect was large. It freed many warriors to move again toward the Little Bighorn Basin. Terry and Gibbon met on the Yellowstone and compared notes. The trail signs were heavy down the Rosebud toward the Little Bighorn. Terry wrote instructions for Custer on the 22nd of June. Custer was to move up the Rosebud, then cross west to the Little Bighorn and strike the village while Gibbon came down the Bighorn. The paper fixed intent, but not time. The 7th Cavalry left the steamboat base with 12 companies, a small Gatling detachment left behind, and a long-pack train. Carbines were mostly Springfield single-shot. Revolvers were Colt. Each man carried limited rounds on his person with more in the packs. Water and grass needs shaped each halt. Scouts from the Arikara and Crow nations read the trail. They saw many pony prints and recent lodge moves. They warned that the village ahead was large. Dust lines on the far ridges marked where bands had moved days before. The regiment pressed on up the Rosebud in heat and glare. Policy pressure showed in small records. Agency letters noted ration cuts when men hunted away from the rolls. Arrests for leaving without permits rose. Traders wrote of new traffic of miners toward the Black Hills. Newspapers carried boast and rumor in equal measure. On the ground, the coming fight would not care about words. Buffalo herds were thinner near rail lines and trails. Hunters ranged far. Families camped where water and grazing held. Circles of lodges strung along river bends for shade and wood. Children played in the shallows. Lookouts watched the high ground. The village rhythm followed summer rules. Custer pushed for speed. He chose to move light and leave the Gatlings with the slower column. Night marches closed distance. Men dozed in saddles. At dawns, the scouts widened their arc. Sign grew thicker. Lodge poles dragged furrows across the grass. Fresh tracks crossed older ones and pointed toward the Little Bighorn. Gibbon moved down valley with infantry and cavalry at a slower rate. His scouts also saw sign. The space between his column and Custer was measured in ridges and days. Only a courier on a strong horse could bridge that gap. The plan needed hours to align. The land would not grant them. Inside the village, councils weighed rumors of soldiers. War leaders set watchers at fords. Pony herds were kept close. Repeating rifles were in some hands. Many others held single shotguns and bows. The strength of the village lay in numbers and in the speed with which riders could mass at a threat and then fade. On the 24th of June, the 7th Cavalry camped short and then moved again at night to gain a dawn view. Scouts from the Crow Nation pointed from a height toward smoke in the valley ahead. The regiment halted. Custer gathered officers and weighed whether to wait for Gibbon or to attack the next day or to strike at once. The choice turned on fear that the village might scatter if warned. It also turned on confidence in shock tactics that had worked before against smaller camps. The country below was cut by bends and side draws. From any one bluff, a man could not see the full length of lodges or the routes of escape. Orders ran down the files. Companies dressed ranks. Officers checked girths and cartridge belts. The pack train was warned to keep up as best it could. Benteen would scout left. Reno would press the upper end. Custer would hold 5 companies to move along the high ground. Timing was now the currency of the plan. Far below, the river curved through cottonwoods. Willows hid paths to fords. Dust lifted where riders moved in the village. The day was already hot. The turn that history asks about still lay ahead. The causes that made it possible were now in place. Policy had set the collision. Distance and division would test the plan. Dawn of the 25th of June, 1876, finds the 7th Cavalry halted on a ridge above the upper Little Bighorn. The air is dry and still. Crow and Arikara scouts point to faint smoke lines that rise and flatten along the bends. From this height, the village length cannot be measured. The regiment listens to the river as if it were a road. Custer studies the ground and weighs his hours. Waiting risks the village slipping away through side coulees once alarm spreads. Striking now risks meeting a force larger than his 5-company striking hand can hold. He chooses movement. Speed will replace certainty. Dust already marks the regiment's passage where men and mules have cut the sage. Before 8 in the morning, couriers ride with the first dispositions. Benteen is sent to the left to scout the high ridges and block any flight that way. He is told to keep moving. The pack train is ordered forward as close as terrain allows. The cartridges on the mules are a promise that must catch the fight. The regiment follows a broad trail down the Rosebud Divide. Lodgepole drag marks cut the grass. Fresh pony sign overlays older tracks. The scouts confer in low voices. They say the village is very large. They make circles with their hands to show the number of lodges. The gesture is read but not fully absorbed. By mid-morning, the heat lifts mirage off the flats. The column lengthens. Reno receives orders to take 3 companies into the valley and charge the upper end of the village once found. He moves with the Arikara scouts as skirmishers. The timber and willows lie dark along the river where bends pinch the floodplain. Signals are improvised from the high ground. A blanket flashed on a lance, a wave of an arm. There is no single vantage where one can see from the upper circles of lodges to the lower curves. This is a field that breaks sight into fragments. The couriers carry meaning across those breaks at a gallop. Sometime before noon, scouts on the bluffs see dust rising in sheets beyond the near river. It is the village moving within itself, families tightening gear and horses. A group of riders on the far bank pace the line of willows. They watch the skirmishers on the flats and then wheel back behind brush. Reno crosses the river near the upper end and deploys in a skirmish line. The troopers dismount to fire by ranks while designated holders stand back with the reins. The first volleys have space between them as men measure range and wind. Then the answering fire comes thicker from the left flank and the timber fringe. Women and children run down the river paths toward shelter points marked earlier by elders. Pony herds are pulled behind willow screens. War leaders ride the line and call men by kin and society. Riders slip through the cottonwoods in files of 3 and 5. They emerge at angles that press Reno's left and rear. On the bluffs behind a courier, gains the ridgeline and turns north after Custer. He carries a penciled note that the village is large and that speed is needed with the packs. He drops into a coulee and disappears from Reno's view. The message becomes part of the battle's unseen thread. Reno's line pushes forward and then stalls in taller grass where the ground softens. The shooting grows closer. Some troopers see riders cut across their front at a distance that shrinks too quickly. The order to fall back into the timber is given to buy time. Horses blow through their bits and turn wet with foam. Inside the timber, the men find brief cover. They fire through willows while the holders struggle to keep the mounts from swinging. On the far edge, riders on fast ponies begin to filter around the flank. The first signs of encirclement form as dust spirals rise behind the line like warnings. Reno gives the order to mount and withdraw across the river to the bluffs. In the rush, the formation breaks in the shallows. Some horses stumble on slick stones. Riders go down. Men climb the far bank and run for the high ground as shots hit the dirt ahead and behind them. The retreat is costly in seconds and in lives. On the heights south of the village, the sound of this fight reaches the companies moving with Custer as a steady roll. The bluffs bend north toward coulees that fall to the river. The lead elements pause at a saddle and look down into Medicine Tail Coulee. The river glints beyond, and dust lifts across from the lodges. Custer sends elements forward to test a ford. Men see figures moving in the willows and along a low bank on the far side. Shots snap over the water. The test becomes a check. The push does not break through. The companies pull back up the slope to the spine of the ridge and shift to the next rise. A second courier reaches Benteen with the famous urging to bring packs and to hurry. The paper is brief and scratched in haste. Benteen keeps his files moving, but the ground is broken, and the heat takes a share from every horse. The distance between the left scout route and the main bluffs is a cost counted in minutes. Reno gathers fragments of his command on the first real height and begins to form a perimeter. Men dig shallow scrapes with knives and tin cups. Officers count cartridges and try to sort survivors by company. The pack train is still out on the trail behind. Smoke draws a veil to the north where the other fighting grows. In the village, victory over Reno frees many fighters to wheel and ride toward the bluffs where Custer's movement has been seen. Gall rides with purpose, calling men to follow the coulees that will bring them up under the ridges unseen until the last moments. The river now lies between defenders and attackers at several points. Cloud shadows slide across the heights and make it difficult to read movement at distance. From Weir Point, the field looks like a set of small wars rather than a single battle. Two columns of smoke rise where lodges burn from stray shots or panic fires. The river bends continue to hide the village tail from any single eye. At this hour, the issue is timing. If the 5 companies can break a flank and seize ground near the river, the village may be forced into flight. If they cannot, the riders from the valley will gather in increasing numbers behind every roll of ground. The couriers carry hope in both directions, while the clock erases it. An Arikara scout later recalls the look of the ridges where Custer's men tried to hold and then move again. He speaks of dust that hung and horses that slipped on dry clay when turned too fast. He says the sound of ponies coming through a coulee is like a drum at first, and then like a roar in grass. A short line from the agency record captures the moment when separation becomes danger. The valley force being repulsed, many Indians turned upon the other battalion and pressed them upon the ridges. Godfrey, article, /New York, 1892. The phrasing is measured the meaning sharp. One fight unlocks pressure for the next. On Reno Hill, the first water parties crawl to a shallow draw under fire to fill canteens. The wounded lie in the meager shade of saddles and blankets. Officers send lookouts to the far crest to try again to see the northern ridges where Custer's dust has faded. What they hear instead is a rising weight of shots. Benteen reaches the bluffs and joins Reno. He faces a choice between holding this precarious position or striking toward the heavier fire to the north. Reports conflict, and no man on this hill knows the true shape of the village. The decision to consolidate here is born of ground, and the need to keep a living anchor. To the north, the 5 companies shift from movement to survival. They dismount in sections and fire by volleys, then mount to leap to the next spine. Holders fight with carbines while steadying horses that shy at the sound. The ridgeline is broken by saddles that invite envelopment if a line runs too thin. A Lakota rider later describes closing to a range where he could see the faces of men behind the carbines. He says they fired quick and well, but that the line moved backward and then broke into smaller pieces that could be ridden between. He remembers the smell of dust and powder and hot leather. Telegraph cannot reach this place. What moves is carried in notebooks and in the heads of men who ride between points of decision. The last courier from Custer fails to reach Reno Hill. The gap is now more than distance. It is a change in the shape of the day that cannot be undone from any single hill. By late afternoon, the valley where Reno first entered is quiet except for small fires and drifting smoke. The defenders have shifted their weight to the ridges. The river at Medicine Tail Coulee runs as it did in the morning, but the human geometry around it has changed. Every coulee mouth is now a door for attack. The pack train urged on, since mid-morning climbs the last broken rises toward Reno Hill. Ammunition crates knock against mule ribs. The drivers talk to their animals under their breath, as if words could pull more speed from tired legs. They do not yet know that the urgency they carry cannot arrive where it is most needed. From the high point of Weir, small groups ride forward to look again toward the north. They report scattered clusters of men moving and then disappearing into cuts. No formed line can be seen. The sound is not volley but scatter, and then a sudden swell and then silence. The pattern worries every listener. At the village, The drumbeat of organization resumes after the dash of the first hours. Children are gathered. The old are led to safer draws. Women return to pull down lodges near the edges and to lead extra ponies away from the river. The strength of the community shows in this order amid dust. As the sun begins to angle west, the ridge shadows deepen and make aiming harder. Carbine barrels burn to the touch. Men tear strips of cloth to wrap the stocks. Some spent cases stick in hot chambers and must be pried out with knives. These small frictions accumulate until they affect how a line can hold. The last light of late afternoon turns the river a flat silver. On Reno Hill, the men brace for a night under fire. On the northern ridges, the 5 companies fight for ground that is shrinking by the minute. The incidents of the day have risen in linked steps to a point beyond which retreat will be a collapse rather than a maneuver. The regiment on the 25th of June, 1876, stands in 3 moving parts. Reno with companies AGM prepares to enter the valley. Benteen with companies HDK angles left along high ridges. Custer with companies CEFIL follows the bluffs north. Company B under McDougal guards the pack train with the ammunition reserve. Reno's skirmish line breaks the quiet first. Men dismount to fire while holders clutch reins in the tall grass. Shots answer from cottonwoods and willow edges. Within minutes, the line feels weight on its left and rear. Reno shifts to the timber, buys a breath, then orders a mounted withdrawal across the river to the bluffs. The withdrawal fragments in the shallows. Horses slip and men go down. On the far bank, scattered groups run for the first ridge that gives any cover. Losses mount in seconds, measured by hooves and water noise. The first valley attack has failed, and with it the plan to pinch the village's upper end. News of this reversal does not reach Custer in time to change his path. He has already turned down Medicine Tail Coulee to test a ford toward the village flank. Men glimpse figures through willows, hear shouts, and take fire from low banks. The probe checks, then pulls back up the slope to the ridge spine. A courier rides with a penciled scrap to the leftward battalion. "Come on, big village, be quick, bring packs. Custer, note on the bluffs, 1876, 06, 25. The message sets priority on speed and ammunition, but it must cross broken ground where every minute deepens separation. Benteen keeps his files steady across draws that fold like a fan. Heat takes a toll on horses. The left scout route, meant to guard against flight, becomes a channel that delays support. When he reaches the bluffs near Reno, the choice resolves toward consolidation rather than a blind push into heavier unknown fire. On Reno Hill, an emergency perimeter forms from survivors of AGM and later HDK. Shallow scrapes appear under knives and cups. Casualties gather behind saddles and scant brush. The pack train is still miles back. Cartridges count out loud as men share by handfuls. Water parties begin to crawl toward a dry gully. Downstream, the 5 companies with Custer shift from maneuver to a fight of positions. Sections dismount to fire while holders steady horses that dance at the sound. The ridge line breaks into a chain of knobs and saddles. Each movement forward risks a gap that mounted fighters can slice through at speed. From the village, war leaders ride in bands up coulees that run like hidden streets to the heights. Gall and Crow King and others direct bodies of fighters to come up under the skyline and then flood out at close range. The river is no longer a barrier. Fords above and below feed the ridges with riders. An officer later writes that he saw men pressed back from the ford without a foothold. He notes the ground was cut and the willows close to the bank. The sense is that the opportunity to seize a flank evaporated as quickly as it was glimpsed. The initiative passes to the defenders, who can mass at will. Custer faces an arithmetic that worsens by the minute. 5 companies carry what they can on belts and in saddle pockets. The bulk of cartridges ride with the packs guarded by Company B far behind. Couriers must run a gauntlet to reach Reno Hill, and none now can punch through in time. A small height beyond Medicine Tail Coulee gives a view of tents and dust, but not of the full village tale. From there, The battalion slides along the ridge toward another saddle where fire can be returned downhill. The pattern becomes leap and hold, then leap again with fewer horses and shorter breaths. On Reno Hill, the first burst of relief arrives in the shape of the pack mules. Mule drivers knock open ammunition crates. Cartridges move from wood to hands in frantic lines. A signal officer sketches on paper the shape of the hill to keep track of sectors. The fire from below grows and then fades in waves. Benteen and Reno weigh a push toward the louder firing to the north. The ground in between is a quilt of cuts and low rises that can hide 1,000 riders. The decision to hold is born of caution and the obligation to keep a viable anchor for the regiment's survivors. It is not a choice made lightly. To the north, riders close to within voices. A Lakota fighter recalls seeing faces set in concentration behind short carbines. He remembers the line bending and then thinning. He remembers riding between two clusters, where the ground dipped, and then rising into a space behind them, where horses milled and shouting rose. Company markers mean less now than proximity. CEFIL become clusters around guidons and recognizable officers. The men fire by files, then mount to pull to the next spine where a few boulders or tufts of sage promise cover. When a holder falls, the horses break. Catching them takes men away from the line. An officer on Reno Hill writes after action that he heard a long swell of fire to the north and then a silence that lasted too long to be a mere lull. Godfrey, Article, New York, 1892. The sentence is spare. Its implication is the moment when a fight of movement turns into compression. Non-combatants in the village move in practiced order. Elders and children shift to safer draws. Women pull lodges near the exposed margins and lead spare ponies away from fords. This is a humanitarian geometry playing out under fire, a community's method to protect life while war leaders draw the riders away. Archaeology a century later will read the ground for cartridge scatter and caliber mix, hinting at where lines stood and moved. But the day itself shows its truth to any eye on the ridge's mounted fighters closing on a shrinking perimeter. Single-shot carbines worked hot, a few repeaters answering from the other side. A sudden push by defenders rides along a saddle like water through a breach. The line on the ridge breaks into 3 knots. Men pivot to face attacks from 2 directions. Horses plunge where the drop is steepest. The fight is now measured in tens of yards and in heartbeats taken by exertion rather than fear. On Reno Hill, a second water party drags canteens in a blanket along a shallow cut. A trooper lifts a tin cup to a wounded man who cannot sit up. The sounds from the north come as scattered bursts, then a roar, then nothing. The men look at each other and take positions for the next assault on their own hill. Back on the northern ridge, a brief attempt to push toward higher ground staggers when fire rakes the flank from a parallel cut. Men turn and run a few paces, then turn and fire again. A sergeant shouts to dress on the right, then drops with his horse. The guidon dips and then vanishes amid dust. This is the hour when casualty ranges begin to climb beyond recovery. Later counts will give the 7th Cavalry dead as more than 260 across the field, with 55 wounded found with the Reno Benteen position. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne losses are recorded in the low dozens by most participant accounts and later compilations, though totals vary by source. Fact versus folklore rests here. The exact numbers and their distribution remain debated. The direction of the imbalance is not. Reno and Benteen now receive the pack train fully and begin to build a tighter perimeter. They place men on the reverse slope where incoming fire arcs overhead. An improvised hospital forms behind the crest. A few shots from long range plink among the mules. The hill holds because it must and because it can. A small party rides toward Weir Point to look again at the northern ridges. They see dust trails without formed lines. They bring back word that no organized body of friendly troops can be distinguished. The commander on the hill orders them to return and conserve strength for what may come before night. Sun angle lengthens shadows that help attackers close and hinder defenders' aim. Carbine extraction grows harder in heated chambers. Some cases stick and require a knife blade. Men strip cloth to wrap hot barrels. These frictions, trivial in camp, become decisive on a ridge where seconds measure survival. A rider from the village will later say that he saw men on foot trying to hold horses behind a fold while others knelt to fire. He rode with two companions through a gap where his pony's chest brushed a man's shoulder. The man turned his head not in fear but in effort, as if to see a lane to the next rise. At some point north of Medicine Tail Coulee, 5 companies cohere for the last time in a staggered line over a set of low heights. Later markers will give one knob a name that memory repeats. Last Stand Hill is a label from later years. On the day it was one more piece of ground chosen for its view and its scant cover. Fact versus folklore again. Tidy circles and final volleys in perfect cadence belong more to later imagination than to the chaotic press recorded in mixed testimonies. On Reno Hill, an order is passed in a few words to steady hands and minds as evening nears. Hold this line until dark. Ammunition will be served along the front. Reno Field Order on the Bluffs, 1876, 06-25. Men breathe slower check belts and brace for another rush that does not come before the light thins. To the north, the end arrives not as a single rush, but as many riders pressing from 2 and 3 directions, filling the low places and cresting the saddle at once. Shots become close and then rare. Movement ceases. Dust drifts down. Ponies stand with ears forward. The ridge is taken by men who will later speak of silence and of heat. Evening wraps the valley. Fires dot the village margins where food is boiled and stories of the day already begin to order memory. On Reno Hill, pickets are set. The wounded breathe in shallow gasps. Water runs in quiet in the cut where canteens will be dragged again before dawn. The plan that morning is now a different thing. A defense that must endure the night. Terry and Gibbon will not arrive until the next day. Their columns sleep on trails still measured in ridges and hours. Dispatches written earlier in hope of convergence ride useless in saddlebags. What remains is a held hill and a quieted ridge and a river that shows no sign of the decisions made on its banks. In the village, news passes from circle to circle that the northern riders have closed the fight. Food goes on the boil. Water is carried to the wounded. Grief names are spoken. The order of care in a community runs beside the order of battle. Both say who has the day. Silence after the final rush is not empty. It is filled with hoof sounds, low voices, the click of cooling metal, and the rustle of grass. Survivors on Reno Hill hear none of this. They only read the lack of volley as a sign that no friendly line remains to answer calls. The turn is now irreversible. No courier can arrive with ammunition. No push from the hill can cross hours of hostile ground before dark. The 5 companies are gone as a maneuver element. The regiment exists in 2 islands, and one of them has sunk beneath the ridge. Evidence from later archaeological survey will place dense clusters of spent cases on a few knobs and in saddles between them. That pattern supports a fight that compacted under pressure rather than a single final circle. Fact and science converge on the same shape. Names return at the end of day. A brother calls to a man who does not answer. A warrior speaks of seeing a blue coat with a yellow scarf who fired again and again until he fell. Memory holds details like these because they are true to the hour and to the distances between people and dust. 2 lines close this hinge. First, the failed lodgment at Medicine Tail Coulee prevents any division of the village. Second, the repulse of Reno frees massed riders to encircle Custer's 5 companies. Between those lines is the clock that ran out for men who needed minutes they could not buy. Counterfactuals narrow further. Had Gibbon been within 1 valley's ride, the converging columns might have fixed the village with weight. Had Crook not turned back 8 days earlier, pressure from the south might have thinned the fighters at the Little Bighorn. Each depends on a campaign geometry that did not exist on the 25th of June. The winter count motif captures the hinge with a small figure on a hill, many horse tracks around it, and a river bend drawn like a snake. That is how the turn looks when reduced to marks a child can learn. A hill many riders a bend, and a loss that teaches caution and pride in equal measure. Displacement paths begin the next morning. Families break camp and move toward known exits over the Wolf Mountains. The United States survivors hold their hill and wait for Terry and Gibbon. The turn has already done its work. It has set who moves by choice and who stays by necessity. By nightfall, the place where the decision hardened is quiet under stars. The river reflects pinpoints as if nothing has happened. The ground holds heat and the smell of powder. The battle's most famous question has its answer in this hour it turned, when the defenders gained time to mass and the attackers lost time to support. Morning of the 26th of June. Breaks over a field of silence and smoke. Reno and Benteen hold the bluffs, while skirmishers test their line at distance and then fall away. By midday, riders from Terry and Gibbon appear on far heights. Couriers pass up the last steep slope with word that relief has arrived. The first duty is burial. Details move down the ridges with stretchers made from blankets and poles. Men mark shallow graves where the soil allows and raise cairns where it does not. Officers sketch the positions of companies as best they can. The river moves at its same pace, indifferent to the work. Reports begin that night. Terry drafts a dispatch that fixes dates and general movements. By early July, summaries reach department headquarters and Washington. The annual report of the Secretary of War for 1876 will include these lines and casualty tables that tell the story in numbers with little comment. The Reno Court of Inquiry convenes in Chicago in early 1879 to take sworn testimony on actions in the valley and on the bluffs. Transcripts record officers, enlisted men, and scouts. The record is long and uneven, but it anchors later debate in named voices under oath and in a diagrammed hill. Agency correspondence fills in the human edges. Letters from Red Cloud Agency and Standing Rock in the months after the fight note ration issues, travel permits, disarmament orders, and arrivals of families who had been out for the summer. The tone is administrative. Between lines, it shows stress on daily life. Through late 1876 and into 1877, patrols move across the northern plains. Columns ride to intercept winter camps and to demand weapons at agency gates. The campaign does not end at Little Bighorn. It reconfigures. The effect is pressure across seasons, rather than a single decisive shock. Leaders who fought on the Little Bighorn take divergent paths. Some come into agencies under promises of food and leniency. Others move north into country that offers space and time at the cost of cold and hunger. In September 1877, Crazy Horse dies under guard at an agency post in Nebraska. The report is brief and painful. In 1877 and 1878, Northern Cheyenne families who had been sent south seek to return north. The flights and the hard chases that follow write another chapter of loss and endurance. Army returns court records and press lines trace these routes. The names of children and elders appear in lists that read like ledgers of grief. Land and resource lines harden. By the late 1870s, federal policy around the Black Hills bends toward permanent non-tribal control. Miners and settlers spread along spurs. Grazing contracts and timber leases multiply. The legal question of a taking without just compensation begins a paper trail that will run for generations. Demography shifts on agency roles. Census lists for 1877 to 1880 show families counted in new places, births and deaths, under notations of measles or hunger, and school ages marked for removal to classrooms far from home. The totals are small on paper. The changes are large in village life. Health pressures rise with crowded living and ration cycles. Physicians on agency payrolls file terse notes on outbreaks and shortages. These lines, now brittle with age, document how policy and food systems touch bodies. They sit beside ledger drawings that show warriors and horses in motion that summer, linking care and memory. Culture continues under constraint. Ceremonies adjust to patrol schedules and to the presence of officials who measure and report. Language persists in households and in councils, even as schools work to change what children speak. Songs recount the valley and the ridges. Winter counts add small figures for this year. On the ground at the Little Bighorn, early memorials are military. Markers appear where officers fell. Later, native markers and interpretive panels widen the frame to name Oglala Lakota, Hunkpapa Lakota, Miniconjou Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho perspectives. Visitors walk trails that follow ridgelines, where the wind still carries grass seed. Archaeology arrives a century later, after a grass fire clears brush. Supervised surveys recover cartridges and fragments in mapped scatters that reveal movements and firing arcs. The science does not replace testimony. It converses with it. Together they show compression on a few heights rather than a single neat ring. Memory is kept in homes and at gatherings. Elders tell of riders who returned with dust in their hair and of kin who did not return at all. Names are spoken without ornament. Ledger art made in the years after shows the ford, the coulees, and the last spines of earth in clear lines that a child can read. Administrative rhythms settle into law and policy. Allotment ideas rise in the next decade. Surveyors lay out lines that do not match river bends or family routes. A pattern emerges, documents that say where people may live and move in community practice that preserves ties across those lines. The legal trail on the Black Hills question reaches a high mark more than a century later when a court recognizes a taking without just compensation. The money sits in accounts as communities say the land is not for sale. The case is a line from 1876 written in the language of law rather than in dust. At the battlefield, interpretation grows more inclusive over time. Ranger talks add native accounts and emphasize the scale of the village and the human cost on both sides. Commemorations by Oglala Lakota, Hunkpapa Lakota, Miniconjou Lakota, Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho descendants link the ground to living communities. Education efforts expand. Tribal colleges and cultural programs teach language and history with emphasis on local geographies like the Little Bighorn Valley, the Rosebud, and the Powder. Students read agency records alongside winter counts and oral histories and walk the ground when they can. Knowledge anchors identity. The continuity is not a straight line. It is a braid. Policy, land health, and language twist around each other through the decades after 1876. The braid holds because people make it hold in kitchens, at memorials, and in schoolrooms where a map is not just a map, but a set of remembered paths. The scene closes on a present-day overlook where the river bends and cottonwoods throw long shade. The wind moves through grass as it did that June. The question that guided this episode remains visible from here. The battle turned on time, ground, and numbers, and its aftermath turned on policy and persistence. Communities who fought here continue to name themselves in their own languages and teach their children how to read this valley. In the long arc of the Great Sioux War, scholars converge on three findings. First, winter orders tied to Black Hills gold set a collision course that made a major 1876 engagement likely. Second, the decisive turn at Little Bighorn came in the half hour after Reno's retreat and the check at Medicine Tail Coulee when defenders massed and 5 isolated companies lost support. Third, the tactical victory did not reverse federal policy. Pressure widened in the following seasons. Assessment begins with scale. Recent syntheses emphasize the size and cohesion of the village and the speed with which Oglala Lakota, Hunkpapa Lakota, Miniconjou Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho fighters concentrated from a community base. Terrain literacy and flexible small unit action proved decisive against divided opponents. Numbers remain a careful subject. United States deaths are well documented. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne losses vary by account. Most historians accept several dozen native deaths with uncertainty in totals and names. The direction of imbalance is clear, the exact ledger is not, and responsible narration marks that limit. Weaponry debates persist but narrow. Repeating rifles were present among defenders, yet most guns on both sides were single-shot. Archaeological distributions suggest pressure from many angles mattered more than any single technological edge. Rate of decision rested on time and convergence rather than caliber alone. The Ford question is emblematic of method. Whether a full penetration occurred at Medicine Tail Coulee remains contested. Testimony and material find support a brief attempt fire received and withdrawal. The functional consequence loss of a foothold and initiative anchors the consensus even as micro-details are argued. Leadership narratives carry weight in memory. Named warriors like Gall and accounts tied to Crazy Horse appear across interviews and winter counts, while on the Army side, the focus on George A. Custer can eclipse other company officers and enlisted actions. Current work restores both the collective village response and the multiple company stories on the ridges. Fact and folklore require a final boundary. Clean last-stand circles, synchronized final volleys, and single bullet myths belong to later retellings more than to layered testimonies. The ridge fought in knots, moved under pressure, and ended in overlapping collapses. The planar shape is the sound one. Policy consequences traveled farther than the battlefield. In law and administration, the months after saw tightened surveillance at agencies' disarmament pushes and renewed operations that led to surrenders, removals. And for Northern Cheyenne, the hazardous flights north. The Black Hills issue hardened into a taking that later courts recognized. Cultural continuance threads through the record. Ceremony adapted to surveillance, language persisted in households. Winter counts and ledger art logged imagery of the Ford, the coulees, and the last spines of ground. Present programs in Oglala, Lakota, Hunkpapa, Lakota, Miniconjou, Lakota. Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho communities teach this place as living history. Memory on the ground changed as markers changed. Early emphasis on Army graves widened to include native perspectives, site names, and interpretive voices that explain the village's scale and the humanitarian dimensions of protecting families while fighting. Visitors now read the ridges with two lenses instead of one. Professional consensus today frames the battle as a study in campaign geometry. Divided columns, limited reconnaissance, and delayed logistics met an opponent able to assemble mass rapidly from a village base over interior lines. The turn was a property of that geometry, not of fate or singular heroism. Educational value lies in method. Students can triangulate official reports, sworn testimony, participant interviews, and mapped artifacts to test claims at minute scale. The case teaches how to weigh conflicting sources without abandoning the narrative line that evidence supports. Contested spaces remain open for inquiry. Precise company positions, minute-by-minute movements, and individual roles will continue to invite careful argument. That work done with respect for communities and sources improves the story without changing the main contour of when the fight turned. The field today is quiet, but its lessons are not. Little Bighorn endures because it shows how policy-pressured terrain knowledge and time discipline decide outcomes, and because communities who fought there continue to name the place. Remember the cost and teach the reason the day turned.